go. Yeah, we go. Are you ready? COC. Why you dealing with the cyber threat when you know you got the era right? Yeah. You are not alone, don't do it by yourself. Get you some defense will help. If you know you won't be cyber free, come and get you some COC. Satisfying controls, lock them access points. We won't disappoint. COC, fight cyber threats. Promise you will not regret. We go deep and penetrate. COC, come and see.
Well, I guess I probably should welcome everyone. So, the old Zoom thing. Am I on mute? Am I on mute? Yeah. Well, that's how this starts off, right? So that's technology right there. It's been one of those weeks. I don't know what's in the stars, the skies, or whatever, but had all kinds of tech issues recently, and so for me to not be for me to be on mute at the beginning, no surprises. That's for sure, right? So as I was saying, and you saw my lips moving, but you didn't hear, was welcome to the first episode of Crump on Cyber. And this really is designed to be a podcast about all things cyber. So there really are no limitations. My interest in cybersecurity are vast and varied. My background is pretty varied. Started off in the military, so obviously we got the who kind of USA thing here, obviously, but and doing a lot of work in the defense space these days, and so there's a lot about that going on. But yeah, we're gonna talk about all kinds of different things this week. We've got a little bit later on. We've got a guest, Trevor Sullivan. We're gonna get just a little bit of a taste of this new DoD thing that's out there called the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. We could do a great many segments. We've got a lot of stuff teed up for that because there's a lot of interest in that CMMC and it affects a lot of companies. And so we'll most certainly speak to that. We'll hit on probably, I'd like to say, probably the deepest in the weeds kind of section, right? We're just going to go right into it and around one of these practices around called security engineering. Okay, and we're going to take a bit of that, and not just a bit of that, but just a given set of technologies. So we're going to talk about containers and SDLC and how to secure containers and that kind of a thing. So that's what we've got on for today, and that's the guest. And then tomorrow we're going to talk about cybersecurity careers and a couple of strange things happening. We've got a lot of demand for resources. We've had that for years now, lots and lots and lots of open jobs, but we're seeing a lot of layoffs in the cybersecurity space as well. And so we'll talk about some of that. Now, if you're interested in that kind of a thing, you can go out there now. See across the bottom there. There's a little ticker out on the cybersecuritytrainingco.com website. If you follow the links out there, you'll see a link out there to this thing called the Cybersecurity Careers and Personality Probot. So you just kind of fill out this little form, and it runs off and does its uber little intelligence thing, and very quickly, within just a matter of seconds, generates a report, sends you that report. If you're interested in discussing your report, then I would encourage you to go out and run that thing, get a copy, and then yeah, we'll cover some stuff in the chat and whatever kind of comes up, and look at your stuff. Um and then on Thursday, so the show runs Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. On Thursday, we'll have expect to have a guest CMMC professional and assessor on the call. And we're going to look at some of these scenarios, okay, that are associated with the things that some of these the CMMC folks will find out there in the field, and those scenarios are a big part of the exam process that those folks have to, or, those folks, myself included, had to kind of go through. So we'll look at that kind of stuff on Thursday. Okay. Now for today's show, what we're going to do is, and I know I'm going to screw this up somehow along the way. We're gonna talk a bit about Microsoft. Microsoft's run into some issues of late. Okay, so we'll talk about that. I'll do a tiny little primer about the CMMC thing because it is part of this DoD supply chain security initiative. So it's part of the defense industrial base and how it can really kind of protect sensitive information that's flowing through that supply chain. So give you a little bit of primer of that simply because it's a transition into our special guest, Trevor Sullivan, who's going to be talking about container security and in the context of that CMMC, as I mentioned before. So, all right. So with that said, Microsoft. So the CEO and chairman, Amit Yoran of Tenable, was out there on LinkedIn, and he said that the Microsoft is grossly responsible for some of these incidents. And he said that there's a culture of obfuscation at Microsoft. Okay. So the question is, well, why would a chairman and CEO of a company like Tenable, is also a security company, say those things, right? There's a lot of people out there upset about Microsoft and maybe more concerned, right? Because as we'll see, obviously Microsoft's a global company, and they're not just dealing with your Windows operating system. They've got lots of products, and they do security stuff, and so when they've got problems, we have problems, right? And so that's definitely a big concern for everybody. So, but why recently? Well, if we just kind of take a little bit of a backtrack here. So back on May 15th, Microsoft discovered, or was actually more notified, okay, or they discovered the breach occurred on May 15th, I should say. That they were breached by this group that they call Storm 0588. Okay, and this group that they say is China-based, China-supported, gained access to some of the email systems, and so that's your Outlook web access and Outlook.com kind of stuff. And because of that breach, the bad guys were able to get into 25 organizations. Now, one of those compromised organizations and the email accounts was our U.S. Secretary, Gina Raimondo. All right. So 10 days later, after May 15th, so May 25th, the secretaries over in China met with China and was talking with them about this strained relationship with China. Now we've got a lot of strain on our relationship with China for sure. A lot of concern areas there, needless to say, and we'll see a bit about learn a bit about more China, and it's a whole discussion. I spent some time in China myself, and yeah, so we'll look at some interesting stuff about China, But so that was a May 15th, May 25th, the meeting, but it wasn't until July 11th that Microsoft puts out there on a blog that, hey, we've been breached, and we attribute it to this China-backed group, Storm 0588. Okay, all right, and then the next day, the next day, Raimondo's China counterpart over there, Wang Wenbin, uh, says that the U.S. is the world's biggest hacking empire and global cyber thief, right? So in this in today's day and age, it's like it's just a little bit of back and forth and almost sometimes feel like we're on a junior high school courtyard or something like that, right? All this social media and just back and forth kind of a thing, but yeah, so Microsoft's been breached, pretty important kind of a breach, and it's 2 months later where they're coming to the public and admitting this kind of a thing, right? Um, yeah, certainly I would imagine contributes to why Iran has put that out there on LinkedIn. Now, Microsoft did not discover this on their own. It was actually a monitoring group from one of our federal civilian executive branch agencies. Okay. And kudos to them because, they were using a premium level of auditing and just logging information. And having spent some time at a monitored security services provider, have great appreciation for these monitoring teams' ability to, identify these very kind of advanced and nuanced types of an attack. And so somebody was on their game and noted that there's this event called mail items accessed. And when you access, your email and right, you're doing all this stuff. Well, that's an event that would occur. Okay. But what they noted was that, well, this access to these email accounts was coming from an unusual app ID. Right. And so, uh, being on your game to be able to kind of, identify that we talk about a lot about in cybersecurity about the need to know and understand your assets at an intimate level. Okay. If you're going to be looking for potentially malicious behavior, you have to know what normal and expected behavior is first. Otherwise, you're just kind of chasing your tail, right? So the fact that these folks were on their game is pretty amazing. So they identified this unusual activity, and they notified the FBI and Microsoft, and so they began their investigation, and that's what led to them kind of looking back over the time and saw that the compromise actually occurred on May 15th, right? So, the reality is you take the company, any company, right? We got Trevor coming on here, right? We're going to talk about software code and stuff like that. There is no perfect code except for maybe the hello world, right? No real kind of perfect code that's out there. So that's an unrealistic expectation. That's why we have folks out there all the time looking for vulnerabilities and in the systems and the applications so that we can find them and fix them, right? And sometimes you introduce a fix and then that introduces another problem, right? So sometimes a little bit of a whack-a-mole kind of a thing occurring. So no perfect code, right? So we got that. That's kind of a given. Also consider the fact that we're not pointing any fingers, but Microsoft has hundreds of employees in China. Now we have this whole section of our cybersecurity world around insider threats and being able to look for those kinds of things. And one can only assume that Microsoft is also doing that kind of a thing for any potential insider threats. So no fingers pointed. We don't know that that was the case, but there's a lot of folks over there, right? And then also consider that China is playing a long game, right? They are in a 100-year plan, right, to become the preeminent superpower. Okay, so I've got this. I was just kind of looking through. I've got this book, China's Vision of Victory. by Jonathan D.T. Ward. Okay. And there's a section in here where he talks about towards 2049, China's vision of military power. And I'll just talk about a couple of tech related kinds of things. And so in here refers to the state council's new generation of artificial intelligence development plan. Okay. And they're talking about a strategic solution. Now keep in mind that this is already, we've got this topic of AI, right? Now, I know everybody's jumping up and down right now about AI. This book was written in 2019. So, yeah, AI was on the, we certainly knew it was out there, enough movies to remind us that, robots are coming to get us kind of a thing, right? So, nobody's stupid about that. But, to already have it kind of called out as a strategic type of a risk, yeah, we obviously some very forward-thinking kinds of things. So, in here it talks about AI has become the new focus of international competition. AI is a strategic technology will lead in the future. The world's major developed countries are taking the development of AI as a major strategy to enhance national competitiveness and protect national security. All right, so AI certainly top of mind for China, and another one, quantum computing. So quantum computing, right, it allows for this unbreakable communication links. And China endeavors in quantum computing technology, assisted at present through the access of major research institutions throughout the Western world, may enable the CCP to achieve what Pan Jinwei, the father of Chinese quantum information science terms, quantum supremacy. All right. So they're not looking for second place, right? So whatever it takes, yeah, we've got an adversary obviously that's out there that's looking to do that. And as we saw before, a little bit of finger pointing back and forth. And then, as I mentioned, no perfect code, just this year, Microsoft themselves have patched approximately plus or minus 700 vulnerabilities in their systems, 10% of those roughly critical. All right. So they're working hard, but they're finding a lot of problems. Okay. And so it's a bit of a challenge for them. Now, to make matters worse, it wasn't just that. Okay. So here we got the Russians are coming, right? So on August 2nd, and a Russian APT, an advanced persistent threat. Now, an APT, as the term there, advanced persistent threat, makes you think is that they're a very advanced, often nation state backed a type of an adversary, really smart, get into your environment, oftentimes lay low, monitor until they decide whatever this action on objective that they want to kind of take, and that might just be, hey, exfiltrating data, sensitive, important data from the victim's environment, or it might be at some point actually causing some disruption. But on August 2nd, we have the Russian APT-29, also goes by Cozy Bear, that compromised dozens of organizations, including some government agencies, by using a highly targeted social engineering campaign that leveraged this previously compromised Microsoft 365 accounts. And they went out and they built these technical support looking or themed kind of domains. And then they used those to lure people into that environment. Hey, we're here to provide technical support. And as part of that process, they would get them to share the one-time passcodes of these pins that are being generated by the Microsoft Authenticator application. And if that person gave them that code, and that is something, right, that there's a lesson for everybody here, right? Don't ever, ever, ever give those one-time passcodes and pins to anybody, right? That is just, that's a rule in life. Okay. Don't do that. Why? Because the same thing's going to happen that APT 29 does. They take over your account. Okay. And so now you no longer have access to the stuff. And depending upon, what it is that they're after, they might be able to, use that to move laterally across your organization and still sensitive data. So you definitely got to be on your game, okay, for that kind of stuff, right? So that happened. And then, just last Friday, August 11, with the Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, okay, he has announced that in their next cybersecurity review board, they're going to include a review of this malicious targeting of these cloud computing environments. Okay. Now, interestingly enough, this CSRB thing is an outcome from an executive order from May 12th of 2021 about improving our nation's cybersecurity. Okay, so part of that executive order said, "Hey, go build this board to be able to kind of do these investigations. Go, deeper dive into what happened there." There are a number of things that came out of that executive order, but another one, just oddly enough, is around standardizing the federal government's playbook for responding to cybersecurity vulnerabilities and incidents. And there's a lot of attention around this whole incident response stuff. We see a lot of stuff coming down from legal regulatory authorities about escalating the importance and the visibility of these incidents all the way up into the organization, all the way up into the board. And so we could talk all day long, and we will do sessions and topics on incident response. I've actually written a book on the cyber crisis management planning and that kind of stuff. So it's certainly one of those passion areas for me personally. So this kind of thing, I love to kind of see it, but very timely because we've got lots of incidents, and a key player like Microsoft certainly becomes a concern. And it's not just concern, obviously because, Microsoft is everywhere, but related to the topic we're about to get into here about the CMMC stuff is in March, Microsoft went through what's called a joint surveillance voluntary assessment. Okay. Now, this is part of this new Department of Defense cybersecurity program called the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC. Okay. And that's a little bit of what we're going to talk about with Trevor here in just a few minutes. But the idea is that the DoD wants to protect this sensitive information that's part of their contractor supply chain. They call that Defense Industrial Base, or the DIB, right? And that DIB is part of a much larger global defense supply chain. So typically, companies that are, have these contracts with the DoD, they're going to need to, either go, have to do a volunteer or to do a self-assessment, depending on the kind of information that they deal with in these contracts, or they're going to be subject to a third-party assessment. And so they're trying to do is, get these companies in the DIB to get started, right? To demonstrate that you actually have implemented these controls that have been really kind of required for years now. But what they have found is, hey, we look around and, hey, we got these F-35s, and hey, what's that thing up in the sky that looks just like an F-35? Oh, well, that's a Chinese J-31 gyrofalcon. It's like, oh, okay, that's not good, right? And then they have conducted surveys of the DIB themselves, and that DIB has admittedly said that, hey, we're not familiar with the legal regulatory stuff that tells us that we need to do, implement these controls, let alone know what the controls are, right? So the DoD, looks across and says, hey, okay, we need to transition from this trust model where you said you were going to do it to a model where hey, we're going to send out these teams of third-party assessors from private industry, go build, kind of build out this ecosystem of third-party assessment organizations, and go out and do these assessments for the some of the more important programs that they got out there. And there's about 80,000 companies or so that are likely subject to this program. So this joint voluntary program is designed to, hey, let's get this party started. We don't have official CMMC stuff yet. It's currently going through a rulemaking type of a process, but let's allow these organizations, to come through. And if they want to voluntarily kind of go through that process, that's fantastic, right? So, uh, it's typically it would be for contract companies that are building something for the DoD. Now, Microsoft wouldn't typically fit into that model, and so the fact that they went off and did this joint surveillance, voluntary assessment is I wouldn't say unusual just yet, but given some of the things we're learning about what's potentially coming down the line with some changes to the CMMC, it might make a bit more sense, but typically not, right? They're not building, individual, very, customized kinds of things for typically for the DoD. And so they wouldn't necessarily always be subject to those kinds of things. But we typically would view them as an external service provider for the companies that are building the products and things for the DoD. So the fact that they went out and actually went through an assessment on themselves, certainly kudos for them for doing that. Okay. And one of the benefits certainly will be that for any of those companies, in particular small companies who might struggle a bit with trying to implement some of these required cybersecurity controls, they can utilize obviously the Microsoft technologies to help them get down the road with regard to the implementation of these controls, because a company can inherit the controls from an external service provider. So yeah, you've got somebody like Microsoft who's, obviously as I mentioned, they've got, your operating system, but they also have products and they also have security stuff. And so it's a great piece, a great thing for them to really kind of have that in place. But, but there's always a but, right? But as we've seen, Microsoft has had some problems, some challenges. And so if we're saying, hey, look, Microsoft is a conduit into conformity to these security controls, and it's part of this ecosystem, this defense industrial base. We really need to kind of just be a little careful about this, because obviously any company that is part, as any external service provider, anybody that's part of the supply chain, the same risk would be there, that if they're introducing risk via the supply chain or via being an external service provider, that clearly is something that we have to be on our game about. It's all part of this, we have the supply chain where you've got, a big contractor, and then they have some subcontractors, and then those subcontractors have more subcontractors, and it just kind of works its way down, right? Well, we have that kind of thing. But we also have this IT supply chain, right? So if we got these products and tools and things that we've got in our environment, and a lot of times we just subscribe to these automatic updates. And then whoever that external company is, when they get breached, then the bad guys go into those systems, and then that automatic update of that product in all of their customers, that's how we have these systemic global types of issues. The two most prominent ones that we've had over the last few years is certainly SolarWind and Log4j are a couple of those. But part of the CMMC is do a better job of tracking those kind of maintenance and updates and things like that. And so hopefully we'll see some of that. But there are multiple kind of supply chains we got to be very cognizant about. Microsoft's had some challenges, right? They've been they went through this assessment. Okay, that's great. But we always have to be on our guard, for sure. All right. So, all right. That said, we're going to take a quick break. We come back. We're going to have a conversation with Trevor Sullivan. Trevor is a software engineer guru. He's a dev advocate, open source and automation guru. You can find Trevor's stuff out there on YouTube at Trevor Sullivan. Subscribe, like, follow, give him a big hug virtually if you can. His latest videos he's got there on the Rust tool chain, Rust data types and variables, and installing Rust on an Ubuntu Linux server. Okay. All right. So we come back to break. We're going to have Trevor on the line to continue the conversation. All right. Just as soon as I can kind of figure out how to do this.
CLC. We'll be right back, baby. COC's back. Come get you some.
All right, let me get rid of that agenda. Trevor, welcome to the party.
Hey, how you doing, Jeff?
Yeah, I'm doing well. So yes, really excited to have you here. We're going to talk about it. I was telling the folks before you joined that this practice that we've got in the CMMC is pretty far down in the weeds. Okay, the security engineering stuff. This control is all about employing architectural design, software development techniques, and systems engineering principles that promote effective information security within organizational systems. And containers, very popular, very big thing, right? We got some apps being built out there, some systems being built using containers. And we know that there are going to be companies within the defense industrial base that are employing these technologies. And so, I want to have this conversation and understand, have you lay out for folks when it comes to containerization, how do we manage these things? Because in this practice, there are a couple of objectives. It talks about the software development techniques that promote effective information security are identified, and then it talks about the fact that these things are employed. But you don't just do software development it's not just, the techniques are, you got to build it, you got to, and then you got to compile it, you got to build it, you got to bring it all together, and then you got to deploy it. And all along this life cycle, there are risks, right? Security concerns. So I'll turn it over to you and see what you got to say about this containerization stuff. How do DIB contractors manage this technology?
Yeah, well, obviously containerization has evolved very rapidly and continues to evolve very, very rapidly. In fact, Kubernetes is coming out with releases on a regular basis. That's one of probably the most popular orchestrator out there for container-based solutions. But there's a lot of different ways to deploy containers, and that's really what makes containerization such a great technology. I didn't really hear about containers until around 2016. I actually attended DockerCon, which was Docker's conference out in the Seattle area. And, that's really where I kind of started my career in containerization. And it was really interesting to me because at first it kind of looked and felt like a virtual machine. It's like, oh, is a container a virtual machine? Do I just kind of run a Linux virtual machine inside of a Linux host? How exactly do these work? But containers are a lot lighter weight than an operating system. They don't have their own separate kernel like a virtual machine does. There's no hardware virtualization that's going on. So when it comes to containers, they're very lightweight compared to virtual machines. So you get really high density, right? You can scale out an application and run many, many instances of an application on, even a single server or an entire cluster of servers. And when you start operating containers at scale, that's where the need for some kind of orchestration solution comes into play. When you are running hundreds or thousands of containers across a cluster that could have tens or hundreds of nodes, or maybe even thousands of nodes inside of it, you need some kind of mechanism to keep track of which containers are running on which node, and ensuring that each of the containers in each of the applications that's being deployed out to the cluster is getting allocated a certain amount of resources, CPU resources, memory resources, storage, networking resources, and everything like that. So orchestration is really essential. Kubernetes, of course, is kind of the most popular self-hosted type of orchestration solution, but a lot of the cloud vendors like Amazon Web Services, for example, they actually have cloud native orchestration solutions that allow you to deploy container-based applications without necessarily having to have expertise in deploying and managing the orchestrator itself. So you can kind of get as complex as you want or as simple as you want when it comes to containerization. Any thoughts on that, Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, does that simplification, right? When we have that much simplification as part of the process, sometimes security ends up just not even being a consideration, right? They just want to get this thing out there, right? And so how, what's the strategy for managing how this orchestration, right? So we talk about here about this software development techniques, and a lot of folks listening will be used to the traditional dev, test, pre-prod, prod kind of a process, and likely hopefully a release engineer that's somewhere in there kind of managing that kind of a thing. But when we have one click deploy, how do we kind of inject our security into that flow, that orchestration piece?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, this is a very complex field. There's lots of moving parts. There's so many different technologies that are being employed at any given time, even just within a single company, right? You might have a bunch of different tech stacks that are being used. One team might be using a lot of JavaScript to do front-end application development. They might be using React or Vue.js or something like that. And so they're working with, the JavaScript language. They're working with the NPM package manager and other tools like that. But then other service teams that are building, maybe back-end APIs or doing ETL types of jobs against databases. Maybe they're using kind of internal systems programming languages like Rust or Golang or PowerShell automation. And so it's really every team's going to be using a different type of tech stack out there. But what you can do is incorporate, security as part of your development process. That's kind of where that term, DevSecOps comes into play, where security is just an essential component. It's a core component of the entire software development lifecycle. So, when you're building out code, you need to know pretty quickly if there are any known vulnerabilities inside of dependencies, inside of the packages that your application is depending on. And so you need some kind of automated process to just go out, examine all of the dependencies that your application declares in its manifest files, and go out to a database and actually look and see if there's any known vulnerabilities. And if there are, to remediate those types of vulnerabilities, you may either need to remove that dependency entirely if there's no update available for it. Maybe you'll have to either develop your own functionality to substitute that particular dependency, maybe create your own fork of it, or perhaps you just, if it's easy enough to upgrade it to a new version, you could do that as well. If there's been a patch that's been made available and it's just as simple as going in and incrementing the dependency version, then you can do that, redeploy your software, and then hopefully that new version of that dependency will be scanned and then ultimately determined not to have whatever vulnerability that is. But what's really core at the heart of those types of solutions is the ability to query one of these known vulnerability databases to find out which dependencies and which specific versions of those dependencies have any known vulnerabilities. And you can do that type of dependency scanning either kind of at the operating system level. So let's say that you're running, Ubuntu Linux or CentOS or something like that. You've got package managers, apt package manager, the yum package manager, the zipper package manager, which I think is used on OpenSUSE Linux. And so you can kind of handle all these dependencies at the operating system level, but then also your application code. If let's say you're deploying a JavaScript project, you typically have a package.json file that declares a bunch of application specific dependencies. And these vulnerability scanners can look both at the OS package managers as well as the application framework package managers to determine, where vulnerabilities may exist. Some of these tools involve, there's an open source one from a company called Aqua Security called Trivy. Trivy is this open source vulnerability scanner. It kind of breaks open your containers and looks at the dependencies that your containers are using and helps you as a development team to kind of figure out if there's any known vulnerabilities inside of packages that your application containers are built on top of.
Oh, brilliant. So yeah, there's some concern about this open source kind of stuff out there. So you got something like Trivy. So any security concerns about using open source tools like that as part of this process? It's a critical kind of piece of the process to be able to identify that. We certainly don't want security vulnerabilities in our security products. So we were kind of talking about with Microsoft. So, maybe just a little bit about that since it's a critical part of that process.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of security companies that are financially backing these open source projects. So, while it's always certainly a good concern to be up to date with your security protocols, these tools are really what help you to accomplish that. So when you've got companies like Aqua Security or there's another tool out there that does kind of cloud native monitoring for containerization called, I'm totally blanking on the name of it right now, but it's called Falco, actually. I just popped into my mind. There's an open source project called Falco backed by another company. And these types of tools are really kind of the cutting edge utilities that you can use to scan your container images, to monitor, what's going on inside of the container, inside of the application itself, and to be able to build, rule sets to determine if that traffic should be flagged as potentially malicious traffic, or if that's, considered acceptable, normal business traffic. So there's a lot of different tools out there. They all kind of achieve security at different levels. Some of them could be dependency scanners. Some of them could be doing kind of real-time monitoring as far as what's happening inside those application containers. You can apply things against production clusters that actually go out to your running containers on a production cluster and actually kind of scan those as well. So there's lots of different stages that you can kind of plug into. You can plug in at the dev stage, you can plug in at the prod stage, you can plug in the QA stage and kind of see how your applications are behaving on a cluster. And so really it's kind of important for engineers these days to be familiar with all these different tool chains, such as Trivy, Anchor is another one, Gripe is another one, Gripe with a Y, not an I. There's just tons of open source utilities out there that help us to achieve security and kind of keep our fingers on the pulse of what's going on with container-based applications.
Yeah. So how does this fit into, I hear Docker out there, it seems like everywhere you turn around, you hear this Docker stuff. So how does that fit into this mix that we're talking about, the orchestration and the containers and the security and the lifecycle and the change management, all the different elements of the process that we get concerned about here as part of an SDLC?
Yeah, well, Docker is kind of, in most people's minds, or at least my mind, I speak for myself, is kind of synonymous with Linux containers. I mean, there's lots of utilities that you can use to spawn Linux containers without having to use Docker. There's utilities like Podman, for example. There's something else called nerdctl, which is another open source project that allows you to spin up containers. But Docker is really the first thing that kind of pops into people's minds when they hear Linux containers, right? And the notion of a Docker file, your Docker file is kind of this instruction file that allows a software developer to start off with a base image. And a base image typically might have, the JavaScript like Node.js pre-installed or Python pre-installed inside of it, or whatever kind of runtime environment that your application requires. If you're a .NET developer, it might have the .NET runtime pre-installed inside of that container, so that you don't have to worry about installing that framework. All you have to do is kind of copy your application files into that container, and it should kind of just work, right? So you typically start with a base image inside of your Docker file, and then you inject your application files into the container image as part of this build process to build your custom application containers. And as part of that process, you also have to install the dependencies from your package manager for your application. So if you're a .NET developer, you can install your dependencies from NuGet, right, using the .NET CLI. If you're a Python developer, you can use the pip package manager to install dependencies from the Python package index. If you're a Golang developer, you can bring in your dependencies from Git repositories directly, and so on and so forth. And so that's a really essential phase of your application build process, is not just copying your app files into the container image, but then installing those dependencies so that when you finally package up that container image and want to deploy it out to something like a Kubernetes cluster or a cloud native orchestration solution like AWS Fargate, for example, then you can basically have everything ready to go, right? You've got the runtime pre-installed, you've got your app source files, you've got all those packages that your app depends on. And now, once you've packaged up that image, you can go ahead and deploy it out to your target environment. So Docker is kind of the primary tool that app developers are going to be using on their development workstation, whether it's a Linux desktop, whether it's a Mac OS desktop, or even a Windows desktop. Typically you install Docker locally on your dev system. You write your application files, you build this Docker file, this instruction file to build your custom container image, inject your app in there with all its dependencies. And then once you've kind of tested out your application locally on your dev system, you can push that container image up into what's known as a container registry. And that container registry really serves as kind of the distribution mechanism for your application once it's been packaged up. And that's the great thing about containers, is that once it's been packaged in a container format, you can deploy to so many different target platforms out there. I mean, there are just tons of different places where you can deploy containers to. You can deploy to a Kubernetes cluster that you run on, let's say, bare metal. You could run Kubernetes nodes in virtual machines. You could use AWS Fargate. You could use AWS Lambda. You can use, I think, Azure App Service or Azure Functions supports containerization. Google Cloud, they've got Google Cloud Run. That's a managed service that allows you to deploy containers straight from a registry somewhere. So that's kind of what that lifecycle looks like. You build your project, you build your container image, you push that container image to a registry, and then ultimately you deploy it to whatever your target cluster environment is going to be. One thing about Docker as well is that they have started to kind of add additional integrations. So one of the security components that's been built into Docker somewhat recently has been integration with a vendor known as SNCC, I think is how you say it, SNYK. And SNCC also offers vulnerability scanning tools to make sure that your application dependencies and OS dependencies are up to date in your container images. So it very similar to some of these other tools that I mentioned previously. It'll scan against a known vulnerability database and kind of flag any critical or high priority vulnerabilities so that the dev team can go resolve those.
Wow, that's brilliant. So the registry, we talked a bit about the SDLC and the movement of the containers. Is that we would certainly view that ability to kind of do that kind of movement as a privileged type of an account. So how is that How is that those roles and functions? Is that defined? And so people can understand, well, where would I go to look for where these groups and roles or these traditional kind of functions are at, so I can validate that there is some separation of duty or separation of roles in there.
Yeah, that's a great question. So as far as like roles and having access to push container images up into a registry, you're absolutely right, Jeff. That is a privileged operation, and a key attack vector for malicious users out there could be to inject vulnerable application dependencies into a business application, a line of business application. And then once somebody deploys that application out to a target cluster environment, well, guess what? They just deployed the malicious person's code for them, right? So having security over that entire build pipeline process is absolutely essential, because it would not be very hard for someone with the appropriate access to simply inject some malicious code, do it very secretly, covertly, and it would be potentially very challenging, depending on what kind of observability tools are available to the organization, to actually catch that type of malware inside of their containers. This is where things like Trojan horses come into play, right? Somebody injects some code, suddenly it connects out to a command and control server. They've got access to your network environment. As you were talking about before I came on, there's lateral movement, right? Where somebody can gain access to the network, they can compromise one application, and then all of a sudden they've got internal access to that cluster. They can start to kind of poke and prod around and figure out what other applications are running on that same compute environment. So when it comes to permissions that you specifically asked about, it really depends on what type of registry solution you're using. Now, if you're using something like Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure or Google Cloud Platform, those vendors all offer managed services for a container image registry. For example, in Amazon Web Services, they call it the Elastic Container Registry, or ECR for short. It's part of their whole kind of suite of container-based services, alongside AWS Fargate and Elastic Container Service, or ECS for short, and Elastic Kubernetes Service, or EKS. So ECR in AWS is literally just a registry. You basically push your container images up into that registry, and then anybody who has access to connect to the ECR endpoints and has the permissions from the Identity and Access Management Service will actually be able to connect to that ECR endpoint, download the container images, and execute those application containers. If you're in a Microsoft Azure environment and you're using their managed container registry service, then of course you're going to use Azure Active Directory to lock down access to manage the container registry itself. But then there's tokens that you can generate as well, so that somebody can have user level permissions to that registry, but not necessarily have an administrative access to that registry service. So each identity system kind of integrates with the corresponding cloud vendor's registry service. Now, if you're looking for a self-hosted kind of cloud agnostic solution for a container registry, you can actually run the official Docker registry. There's also open source solutions. There's one out of VMware that's actually really interesting called Harbor. So if you just search for Harbor Container Registry, this is a really popular open source project that allows you to store your container images. It also has built-in vulnerability scanning. I think it uses Trivia under the covers, but don't quote me on that. But it's a really great, very mature project for hosting your container images. And I'm sure that there's other registry solutions out there as well. In fact, Red Hat, the makers of Red Hat Linux, they have a solution called Quay. So if you go to quay.io, they actually have an open source version of their own managed registry as well. So if you look on GitHub for the Quay project, they provide that as a registry that you can either use the managed service at quay.io, or you can just deploy your own registry using their Quay software as well. And each of those open source solutions is going to have its own kind of built-in mechanism for managing user accounts and whether you have permission to actually push container images up into that registry.
Gotcha. Yeah, I can hear and virtually see the smoke coming from people's ears out there. And one of the things that I know they're thinking about is so when it comes to the CMMC thing, right? We got two kind of types of information that really is kind of front and center. This stuff called federal contract information, and then this other stuff called controlled unclassified information. And so when it comes to the controlled unclassified information, those environments where they're processing, storing, transmitting this CUI stuff, right? This information, well, they need to be in an environment that meets these FedRAMP moderate security kind of controls in place, right? And so some companies will host those host environments in FedRAMP type environments, and then others you can have a non-FedRAMP cloud environment, but it still is expected to still being doing the same kinds of security controls. And so for some of the some of the big name kind of cloud environments, I would imagine they probably a tendency to kind of move towards those or gravitate or run those kind of container environments there. The other ones, you probably, I guess, from the perspective of the companies themselves, they probably would need to just do a double check to make sure that the cloud environments are going to meet, the requirements that are outlined as part of this Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement kind of a thing that's out there that defines the controls. Anything else that you want to kind of just share, Trevor, about security related to containers or anything like that before we kind of put a bow on it here?
Well, just want to emphasize that there are lots of different ways to do things out there. There's not really a one-size-fits-all solution. There's lots of different vendors out there that are doing things in the containerization space. There's lots of vendors out there who are also just supporting the open source community as well and are creating very valuable tools. Sometimes they're CLI tools, sometimes they're backend services that you can run, like registry storage solutions like what we just talked about. So for engineers who are out there who are working in that space, I would just strongly recommend educating yourself on kind of the breadth of all the different software solutions that are out there. Try not to get pigeonholed on any one tool or one area, because as we talked about before, security is a fundamental part of the development pipeline. Yeah. A lot of people, in my experience, from what I've observed in the industry, tend to identify themselves with a specific area, like, oh, I'm a security person, or oh, I'm a developer, or I'm a DevOps engineer. And those are kind of loaded terms because those jobs evolve very rapidly over time as new technologies are coming out. You were talking about AI right before I came on here just earlier. And I mean, AI is, blown up overnight. I mean, it went from being nothing 5 years ago to being kind of top of mind in everybody's feed when they go on LinkedIn or X.com, I guess they call it now, or other social media platforms like that. I mean, AI is just in your face everywhere. In fact, we were just talking about this the other night, right before we were doing some planning for the show. And so, just try not to get pigeonholed. Always be willing to kind of, absorb new information as it comes in, and always be kind of looking for ways to bridge the gap with other people within your organization, because that'll ultimately make you more effective at what you're doing. And you also have more marketable skills.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of those, I mentioned earlier that you've got your YouTube channel. You've got a lot of stuff out there. So you want to maybe just share quickly some of those key things that you're covering on your channel, Trevor Sullivan?
Yeah. So if you head out to youtube.com/Trevor Sullivan, I've got a relatively small, modest channel there. I've been publishing video content on technical topics since at least December of 2010, I think, is when I put out some of my earliest content. But I've recently been working on some interesting topics. I've got a whole playlist on using LexD or LXD for virtualization on Linux. I've also got a little playlist on some low-code application development, tool building, that kind of thing. So if you're kind of a back-end developer but don't really have the front-end skills, you can kind of use low-code types of solutions to build, useful tools and graphical interfaces without being a professional at it. And I've got other topics like database platforms and open source tools and that kind of thing. More recently, as you just noted, I was building a couple of videos on the Rust programming language, and I'm hoping to kind of evolve that over time. Rust is a high performance language. It's fairly low level compared to a lot of the interpreted scripting languages out there, but it is worth learning. It's growing pretty quickly these days, and I'm seeing the industry kind of move towards that direction. So, if you're interested in those kind of topics, feel free to subscribe, and I'd love to see you there.
Great. Thanks, Trevor. It's been a pleasure having you on. All right. As we wrap up, I just want to do a quick thank you to our sponsors. So CMMC Metacon. So coming up November 14th, CMMC Metacon. It's where the intersection of defense industry, cybersecurity, and the metaverse. So there's going to be a conference held in the metaverse out there, and the topic will be around cybersecurity and the defense industry, all things kind of related to that. There's some international speakers on there for sure. If you go out to CMMC Metacon, check it out. There's some early bird tickets and things available out there, as well as CMMC Training Academy, one of the leaders in the CMMC training side of the house. So thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate you joining and look forward to seeing you tomorrow evening.